We just celebrated the feast of Blessed Karl of Austria, the last emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the last apostolic king of Hungary to sit upon the throne, the last to be crowned with the crown of St. Stephen. And for those of you who followed the novena and who might know something about Blessed Charles, about the coronation rite for Hungarian kings, for the apostolic kings of Hungary, they are not secular rulers. They're not secular rulers. They're temporal rulers. Their authority comes altogether from God to uphold the laws of God in the church and the laws of the nation for the good of the people. And we need to keep in mind that, and so next week is the Feast of Christ the King. So we'll speak about this from a different perspective next week. But our Lord himself speaks about rendering to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Now, Caesars come and go, and empires come and go. There are holy empires, and there are secular empires, and there are wicked empires. Nevertheless, the apostolic king does not seek any gain for himself. He's entrusted with the guardianship of all that belongs to the nation. And so, yes, he wears a 1,000-year-old crown filled with jewels, and he wears a 1,000-year-old cope, and he carries a golden scepter, and he rides in a fancy carriage, and he has servants and such. But that's not for his own gain. He's a guardian of the treasury of the nation. So, with that in mind, then, we have the question which comes up. And I'm referring to a book here called Reclaiming Catholic Social Teaching. And basically it's a summary of the writings of Pope Leo XIII, who was Pope between 1878 and 1903. Very long reign. And his writings, his encyclicals, covered the spectrum of family life, social life, business, economics, government, etc. So, the question comes up then, to whom do we owe our obedience? Now, as Catholics, we understand that patriotism is a virtue. We should be patriotic. We should be good citizens. We should obey the laws. And we should contribute to the good of the society. Now, being patriotic, we also understand that we want this society to be its best. We want it to prosper, but not just materially, not just economically, but we want it to prosper in virtue. That's certainly what a Christian king, a Catholic king, would be given to promote and defend with his very life. And it's something that we as patriotic citizens should take very seriously. There are all sorts of ills in society that we can't do anything about, but we shouldn't be adding to them. We should be promoting the virtue and the goodness of our society and being a good model, a good role model for others. That's what Catholics do. Now, Anthony Esselin in this book writes this: I have often heard the nostrum question authority, but never heard the much wiser nostrum distinguish the true authority from the false. For authorities there must be. When the Russian Emperor Alexander II, a courageous social reformer, was murdered by nihilists, Pope Leo XIII responded with the encyclical De Iuturnem in 1881, whose first word suggests, so early in his reign, a frank appraisal of the hostility against the Church, now extending to hostility against authority per se in itself. Now, let's take a look at what Pope Leo XIII wrote. And this is something to really chew on. Pope Leo XIII in 1881 writes this: although man, when excited by a certain arrogance and contumacy, Contumacy is rebelling against obeying authority. Although man, when excited by a certain arrogance and contumacy, has often striven to cast aside the reins of authority, he has never yet been able to arrive at the state of obeying no one. In every association and community of men, necessity itself compels that some should hold preeminence, lest society deprived of a prince or head, by which it is ruled, should come to dissolution, and prevented from attaining the end for which it was created and instituted. Well, there's a lot to chew on just in those few sentences. Note that he says that society needs to attain the end for which it was created and instituted. So society is creation. It's a creation. Society is created, therefore society is a creature that owes something back to God. Society owes to God that it would fulfill its end. Its end means its purpose. How is it to find completion? Well, our purpose as baptized Christians is to find completion in Christian perfection, to be perfected, which happens only when we die. And whether our life was a perfect disaster or a perfect blessing, nevertheless, when it's complete, it's perfect. It cannot be changed, however imperfect it might have been. So society is, you could say, is in a state of imperfection, but should be striving toward attaining its end. The end of society is to promote lawfulness according to the natural law and the divine law, to render back to God what belongs to God. And that's surprising to us, that society would have a duty to render to God what belongs to God, which means that even secular rulers, though they will not observe it, have an obligation to render to God what is owed to him. And this is what we'll reflect upon next week on the Feast of Christ the King. So society needs to attain its end. It was created for this end. That's a bit of a mystery for us, because we might think that society is just created by the people who make it up, who are part of it. But no, society is created by God because it is part of who we are as human beings. God created human beings for society. Well, let's continue. The only one reason which men have for not obeying is when anything is demanded of them which is openly repugnant to the natural or the divine law. For it is equally unlawful to command and to do anything in which the law of nature or the will of God is violated. If therefore it should happen to anyone to be compelled to prefer one or the other, that is, to disregard either the commands of God or those of rulers, he must obey Jesus Christ, who commands us to render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, and must reply courageously after the example of the apostles. We ought to obey God rather than men. Well, that can be difficult if one is compelled to violate God's law in order to be a good citizen. But to be a good citizen can never mean violating God's law. To be patriotic doesn't necessarily mean that you go along with everything that the contemporary culture is pushing, mainly through the media, which tries to determine culture. Culture needs to come from families. Culture needs to come from our religion. That's where culture comes from. Culture grows out of religion, what we believe to be true and good. So, if we're put in that situation, we have to choose the true good. We have to choose the natural law and the divine law, as opposed to that which is fashionable or trendy this decade. You know, every decade, every century has its trends. Well, the trends right now, and it has been for a while, birth control and abortion, euthanasia, getting rid of people who are in your way, getting rid of people, whether they're babies in the womb or elderly people, getting rid of them because they're in your way of getting what you want, of getting where you want to go, of living the way you want to live. And then we have the violation of the natural law by the legalization of same-sex marriage. Well, the church can never be compelled to promote or defend that because it's against the natural law. Therefore, it is no law. It isn't a law at all. You can't just call, this is what we call positive law. Positive law means it was posited. It was suggested and ratified by a group of people based upon whatever. But that doesn't make it a law. And if it's against the natural law, and against the divine law, you cannot be compelled to obey that. So we don't call that a law at all. And being a good citizen, being patriotic, would actually mean not obeying that, because it's not a law. Let's continue with Leo XIII. The administration of the state must be carried on to the profit of those who have been committed to their care, not to the profit of those to whom it has been committed. In other words, a governor, a mayor, a president, a senator, a representative should never be in politics to make money. A politician is there to promote the welfare of the people entrusted to his or her care, so that they may prosper. The politician should not be prospering at the expense of the people entrusted to their care. Now, and that brings up all sorts of the same things. How much money do politicians get to promote Planned Parenthood? How much money do politicians get to force so-called vaccines or gene therapy on children who don't need it? How much money is involved in that? A politician should never be allowed to take money, especially at the detriment to those entrusted to their care. All right, let's continue. Now, that having been said, we have to say that there are many, many good politicians out there. I can't name them, but let's just assume there are many, many good politicians out there. Whether they're living or dead, I don't know. But there are many, many good politicians out there. So this is not to demonize everybody, but to call to mind the pitfalls and the dangers. You know, the higher somebody's dignity, the further they have to fall, the more precarious it is. And part of being patriotic and part of being Christian also is praying for those in high positions, because they are under extreme burdens, and they are under grave temptations to do the wrong thing. So we need to pray for them, that they will have the grace to respond and do what is right and what is good. All right, let's continue here. Indeed, very many men of more recent times, walking in the footsteps of those who in a former age assumed to themselves the name of philosophers, say that all power comes from the people, so that those who exercise it in the state do so not as their own, but as delegated to them by the people, and that by this rule it can be revoked by the will of the very people by whom it was delegated. But from these Catholics dissent, who affirm that the right to rule is from God, as from a natural and necessary principle. All right, well, this can be a little bit of a mind twist for us, a change in thinking to understand. Now, Leo XIII acknowledges that an official can be elected, and even in the past, there were certain Christian kingdoms, Catholic kings, who were elected, but it was acknowledged that the authority they were given came from God. The power is God's, The authority is with the ruler. We don't want to think about a ruler as having power. Power is dangerous. The power belongs to God, but the ruler has the authority to exercise God's power for the sake of a godly and virtuous kingdom or nation. So with this in mind then, he writes, those who may be placed over the state may in certain cases be chosen by the will and decision of the multitude. As in our country, we have elected officials. And this does not oppose or impugn the Catholic doctrine. By this choice, in truth, the ruler is designated, but the rights of ruling are not thereby conferred. So the ruler is designated by the vote of the public. Well, if our votes actually do count, if those elections are actually honest, who's to say? Nevertheless, the person is delegated and designated, but the rights of ruling are not thereby conferred by the public who elected them, nor is the authority delegated to him or her, but the person by whom it is to be exercised is determined upon. So the office itself has an authority from God, and the person who occupies that office is there because God is the source of all power and authority. The people elect the person, but the power does not come from the people, nor is it conferred by the people, nor can it be taken away by the people. That person has to answer to God, not to the people, although by giving to God what is his due, the people will flourish. Now they who say the power depends on the will of the people err, in opinion first of all, then they place authority on too weak and unstable a foundation. For the popular passions, incited and goaded on by these opinions, will break out more insolently, and with great harm to the commonwealth, descend headlong by an easy and smooth road to revolts and to open sedition. Well, we saw that in the riots previous summer of 2020, where a group of oversized children throw a temper tantrum and expect to be listened to and for things to follow their own passions, their own whims, which are passing. They desire anarchy and chaos. Well, chaos is the Latin word for hell. Do we wish to have a hell on this earth? Well, we know that we won't have a heaven on this earth until God establishes that, when he establishes a new heavens and a new earth. But even so, we are pilgrims in a strange land on our way to heaven. And so we must live as citizens of heaven even while we're on this earth. That can be very difficult. But we know that the laws of our heavenly city are just and true and life-giving. And that if we follow those laws of the heavenly city, we will flourish, our families will flourish, our nation will flourish. We live in a great nation, and there are many holy people here in this nation and in this city. Let us be among those holy people who are making this a decent and a fair and a just place to live. Let us be among those holy people. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.